The tortoise and the trap. The morning ritual never changed. At precisely 5:47 a.m., before the neighborhood stirred, before the sprinkler systems clicked on their programmed cycles, before the first coffee maker beeped in the first kitchen on Magnolia Crest Drive, Dr. Eleanor Vance stepped onto her front porch in worn canvas sneakers and a cardigan that had seen better decades. She watered her tomatoes first. Then the rosemary. Then the stubborn hydrangeas along the left fence that bloomed exactly as well as they wanted to, regardless of what any gardening manual suggested. She did not rush. She had not rushed anything in 4 years, not since she'd left the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency with a classified commendation, a modest federal pension, and a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of vacation could cure. Her neighbors, on the mornings they happened to see her, assumed she was a retired schoolteacher. Maybe a librarian. She was 54, with silver-streaked brown hair she kept in a practical bun, reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and a way of listening to people that made them feel, incorrectly, that they were the most interesting person she'd encountered all week. She drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic the color of old pewter. She brought cookies to block parties and remembered everyone's dog's name. Nobody knew that Eleanor Vance held 3 patents in applied cryptography. Nobody knew she had spent 21 years designing surveillance architecture for the federal government, systems so sophisticated they were still classified. Nobody knew that the reading glasses perched on her forehead were fitted with micro lenses capable of reading digital signal frequencies at 30 feet. She preferred it that way. Riverside Oaks, a planned community of 340 homes in Maplewood County, Virginia, was exactly the kind of place Eleanor had chosen for its apparent unremarkability. Manicured streets. A community pool that smelled aggressively of chlorine. A homeowners association that sent color-coded notices about approved mulch varieties. She'd moved here 2 years ago after her mother died and left her the house at the end of Magnolia Crest, a modest colonial with good bones and a backyard large enough to grow things in. She had planned to disappear here quietly. She had not planned on Diane Whitmore. Diane Whitmore arrived at 7:15 a.m. on the second Tuesday of every month, which was when HOA violation notices were delivered personally by the board president, a distinction Diane apparently considered an honor rather than the territorial performance it was. She drove a white Cadillac Escalade with the vanity plate Oaks 1. She carried a leather-bound clipboard. Her hair was the precise platinum blonde of someone who spent considerable money ensuring it looked effortless, and her blazers, always blazers, in cream or pale blue or the particular shade of champagne that suggested old money without technically claiming it, were pressed to a sharpness that seemed aggressive in a residential setting. Eleanor had been in Riverside Oaks for 6 weeks when she received her first notice. She was pulling weeds when the Escalade rolled to a stop at her curb. Diane stepped out with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once considered that her presence might be unwelcome. "Good morning," Diane said, in a voice calibrated to sound pleasant while conveying the distinct impression that it was not. "You must be Mrs. Vance." "Dr. Vance," Eleanor said, without looking up from the weeds. "Or just Eleanor. Either works." A pause. The kind that Diane probably used to indicate she'd registered a minor impertinence and chosen, magnanimously, to overlook it. "I'm Diane Whitmore. Board President, Riverside Oaks HOA. I wanted to personally welcome you to the community and also," she extended the clipboard, "make you aware of a few items." Eleanor stood, peeled off her garden gloves, and accepted the paper. She read it with the unhurried attention she gave everything. 3 violations. The mailbox post, which was apparently 3/4 of an inch too close to the property line. The wind chime on her porch, which the CC&Rs restricted to non-metallic acoustic elements under Section 9. 2.1. And her front garden, which contained, she had to read this twice, an unapproved plant variety in the form of her rosemary bush, which Diane had apparently decided violated the visual uniformity standards of the streetscape. "The rosemary is a culinary herb," Eleanor said. "It's not on the approved plant list." "Who approved the approved plant list?" Diane smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been asked this question before and found it delightful in its naivete. "The board, Dr. Vance. At the annual meeting. These standards exist to protect property values for everyone in the community." Eleanor handed the clipboard back. "I'll look into the mailbox post," she said pleasantly. "The wind chime is gone already, I put it in storage last week. And I'll be keeping the rosemary." The smile tightened incrementally. "The fine is $150 for the mailbox post and $200 for the plant. Feel free to assess whatever fine you believe is appropriate," Eleanor said, returning to her weeds. "I'll review the CC&Rs and respond in writing within 10 days, as provided under Virginia Code Section 55. 1 to 1820. She heard Diane's heels on the sidewalk. She heard the Escalade door close. She heard the engine start. She did not look up. She made a note on her phone, D. Whitmore. HOA President. Familiar with leverage, unfamiliar with limits. Watch, she might have let it go at that, the small power plays of a small woman in a small fiefdom, if three things had not happened in the following 6 weeks. The first was Marcus. Marcus Webb lived 2 doors down, a retired D.C. police sergeant who spent his days restoring a 1968 Mustang in his driveway and, Eleanor had gathered, doing his level best to stay invisible. He was 62, broad-shouldered, with the careful stillness of a man who'd spent decades in high-alert situations and hadn't entirely figured out how to turn it off. He brought her a plate of his wife's banana bread the week she moved in. His wife, Loretta, had passed 8 months ago. He still said Loretta's recipe when he handed the bread over, and Eleanor understood that this was not an accident. She learned what had happened to Marcus on a Wednesday evening when she found him sitting on his front steps with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had clearly gone cold, staring at something in the middle distance that she couldn't see. She sat down on the steps beside him without being invited, because he was the kind of man who would never ask. "She sent you something," Eleanor said. "Not a question." He looked over, mildly surprised. "How'd you know?" "You had the same look when you mentioned the association meeting last month. Like you'd seen something ugly and were deciding whether to do anything about it." Marcus set down the mug. "Got an email," he said. "Anonymous. Had a photo attached. The photo," he explained, had been taken through his garage window 6 weeks ago, on a night when he'd sat in Loretta's old car. She'd driven the Accord, not the Mustang, and had a few fingers of bourbon and talked to her a little out loud, the way people do when grief gets too heavy for silence. Someone's camera had captured it through the window. The angle was high. Mounted, not handheld. The accompanying message was 4 sentences. It noted that the community had strict rules about alcohol consumption in vehicles on residential property, per some subsection of the CC&Rs he'd never heard of. It noted that the behavior reflected poorly on community standards. It suggested he reconsider his participation in upcoming board elections. And it ended with a sentence that had no ambiguity whatsoever: "These matters don't need to go further if we can count on your cooperation." Eleanor looked at the phone screen for a long time. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Figured it was better to lay low." "How long ago did you get this?" 3 months. She handed him his phone back. "Don't delete anything," she said. "Not yet." The second thing was Priya Anand. Priya was 36, a pediatric nurse at Maplewood County Medical Center, and the only resident on Magnolia Crest Drive who had filed a formal complaint against Diane Whitmore in the past 18 months. The complaint had concerned $1,200 in HOA fees Priya was certain were fabricated, assessed for delinquency on payments she had receipts proving she'd made. The complaint had been reviewed by the board, of which Diane was president, and dismissed. Priya had been assessed an additional $300 administrative review fee for filing it. She came to Eleanor's door on a Friday night, and Eleanor knew immediately that something was wrong because Priya was a composed woman, the kind of composure that got built by years of pediatric emergency shifts, and tonight her hands were shaking. Eleanor made tea. She let Priya sit for a full 2 minutes before asking anything. "I got a video," Priya finally said. She'd been crying in her car after a 16-hour shift. She did this sometimes, she explained, not because she was unstable, but because she was human and occasionally needed 3 minutes to fall apart before she could drive home. The video had been taken from outside the car, through the driver's window, with extraordinary clarity. Whoever had recorded it had access to equipment that no private individual should have pointed at a public nursing employee's vehicle in a residential parking structure. The accompanying message had been precise in its cruelty: "Your employer has a responsibility to assess the psychological fitness of its medical staff. I would hate for this footage to raise unnecessary questions. Withdraw your complaint and your account will be adjusted to 0. Priya had held it together through telling Eleanor all of this. She held it together right up until the moment she said, "I worked 40 hours that week without sleeping more than 3 hours a night because we were understaffed, and then I took 3 minutes to cry in my car, and now someone wants to use that to end my career," at which point her composure broke cleanly and quietly, the way good things break when they're stressed past their limit. Eleanor put her hand over Priya's on the table. She did not say "don't worry." She did not say "it'll be okay." She said, "May I see the message?" She looked at the email metadata for approximately 90 seconds. She looked at the video file's digital signature for another 30. Then she took off her reading glasses, The real ones, not the equipment ones, and set them on the table, and she said, "Priya, do you trust me?" "I don't know you very well," Priya said honestly. "Fair," Eleanor said. "Then trust me enough to not delete anything and to not respond to that message. Can you do that?" Priya nodded. "Good." Eleanor stood and picked up her mug. "I need to make a phone call. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." She went into the study, closed the door, and stood for a moment looking at the corkboard on the wall where she'd pinned nothing but a community map of Riverside Oaks and 12 sticky notes in 3 colors. She updated 2 of them. Then she called an old colleague. The third thing was what happened to Eleanor herself. She had submitted, in writing, a formal request to review the HOA's financial records and service contracts, as explicitly provided under Virginia Code 55:1-1820. The request had been filed precisely, referenced the correct statutory provision, and arrived at the HOA's registered agent address by certified mail with return receipt. She had kept a copy. She had photographed the envelope before sealing it. She had noted the time and date. 14 days passed. No response. On the 15th day, she received a letter from a law firm in Richmond, informing her that her request had been reviewed and declined on the grounds that she had demonstrated a pattern of contentious behavior toward the association and that releasing financial records would constitute an undue burden. The letter was 6 paragraphs long and cited 3 clauses of the CC&Rs that, when Eleanor looked them up, said nothing remotely resembling what the letter claimed they said. She sat with this for one evening. Then, on the following morning, something else happened that had nothing to do with paperwork. She was on her daily walk. She walked the same 2-mile loop every morning, because routine was a form of intelligence gathering when you knew how to use it, when she passed the community pool and heard Diane speaking to another board member, a man named Roger Hallstrom, who handled maintenance contracts. Eleanor was behind the hedgerow. They did not know she was there. "The Onan woman won't be a problem much longer," Diane was saying, in a voice stripped of its usual pleasantness. "And the new one at the end of Magnolia? She thinks she's clever with her little legal requests. She won't be the first lonely divorcée who moved here thinking rules didn't apply to her." "She filed a statutory request," Roger said, sounding uneasy. "Roger?" Diane's voice dropped half a register. "Who do you think sits on the county planning board? Who approved the variance for the Riverside Oaks Phase 2 expansion? These people have one house. I have relationships." Eleanor walked past the hedge at a comfortable pace, nodded pleasantly at Roger, who went visibly pale, and continued on her loop. She made a note, "Add Roger Hallstrom. Uncomfortable. Possible soft point." She also made a different kind of note, in a different part of her mind, the part that had spent 2 decades watching systems fail because the people running them had confused access with authority. Diane Whitmore didn't know who she was dealing with. That was useful. Eleanor had been careful, since leaving DARPA, not to use her skills for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She'd made herself a rule about it, the way some people made rules about drinking or spending. The capabilities she carried in her head were not toys. They were not party tricks. They were the product of work that had required her, sometimes, to do things she did not enjoy, and she treated them accordingly. But there was a threshold. She had always known there was a threshold. She began quietly. The first thing she did was map the surveillance infrastructure of Riverside Oaks. She did not do this by going outside and looking. She did it from her kitchen table, with a laptop, a signal analyzer the size of a thick paperback book, and approximately 4 hours of focused attention on a Tuesday afternoon. What she found was not what she expected to find. The HOA's publicly stated security system consisted of 8 cameras at community entrances and 2 at the pool area. The board had referenced this in their annual report, with a line-item budget of approximately $14,000 annually for maintenance and monitoring. Eleanor found 43 cameras. 33 of them were not on any document she could locate in the HOA's public filings. They were not mounted at entrances or common areas. They were positioned at angles that served no security purpose for common property. They were positioned to capture private driveways, backyard fence lines, garage windows, and the interiors of vehicles parked on residential streets. She cross-referenced their signal signatures with the HOA's registered internet account. They were all connected to the same router. She sat with this for a long time, because even for someone who had spent 2 decades in intelligence architecture, the scale of what she was looking at was notable. This was not a security system. This was a network. She made her list. 43 cameras. 33 undisclosed. Signal traffic patterns suggesting continuous upload rather than local storage. Destination IP addresses that resolved, after some careful work, to a company registered in Delaware under the name Clear Data Residential Analytics. She ran Clear Data. Clear Data Residential Analytics was 18 months old. Its registered agent was a law office in Wilmington. Its stated business purpose was community data management services for planned residential communities. Its parent company, after 2 levels of corporate structure, was a firm called Stratford Behavioral Insights, which was, in turn, partially owned by a venture fund that had, in its portfolio, 3 marketing analytics companies and 1 data brokerage that had been the subject of an FTC inquiry 2 years prior. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Sandra Cole. Sandra Cole was 41 and worked for the FBI's cyber division out of the Washington field office. She and Eleanor had overlapped for 3 years on a joint task force in the mid-2000s, when Sandra was a junior agent and Eleanor was explaining to rooms full of federal employees how digital footprints worked. Sandra had been, Eleanor recalled, the only person in those rooms who asked questions that made Eleanor think. They had stayed in loose contact. The kind where years passed between calls and neither of them felt badly about it. "I'm going to need you to hear me out before you say anything," Eleanor said when Sandra picked up. "Hello to you too," Sandra said. "There's a planned residential community in Maplewood County running an undisclosed surveillance network with 33 cameras that are feeding continuous data to a shell company with FTC-adjacent history. At least 3 residents have been targeted with what appears to be extortion using footage from those cameras. The HOA president appears to be the architect." A silence. "Say that again," Sandra said. Eleanor said it again, more slowly, with specifics. Another silence, longer this time. "This is your retirement," Sandra said. "It is. You moved to the suburbs." "I did. And you found, I know what I found, Sandra. That's why I'm calling you." Sandra exhaled. "What do you have documented?" "Currently, the signal analysis, corporate structure research, 2 extortion communications with intact metadata, and the recorded statements of 2 victims. I'm working on the financial trail. How long to get me something I can take to a magistrate?" Eleanor considered. 3 weeks, if nothing unusual happens." 2 weeks, Sandra said. "Ellie, if this company is selling behavioral data from private residences without consent, that's a federal wiretapping issue, not a HOA dispute. How many residents are we talking about?" 340 homes, Eleanor said. Another silence. "The longest one yet." 2 weeks, Sandra repeated. "And don't do anything that creates chain of custody problems." "Sandra," Eleanor said, with mild reproach. "Right. Sorry. I forgot who I was talking to." Eleanor worked the way she always had, systematically, without urgency, and with the particular kind of patience that people who have never done intelligence work mistake for passivity. She documented the surveillance network with a precision that would have satisfied a federal warrant application, because she had written enough of those to know exactly what they required. She cataloged every camera location, every signal timestamp, every upload interval. She built what she privately called the architecture map, a complete technical diagram of how data flowed from the cameras through the HOA's router to the Clear Data servers, with timestamps proving that the uploads occurred continuously, not just during security incidents. She tracked the financial structure. This took longer, because the money moved through 3 corporate layers, but Eleanor had spent a decade tracing terrorist financing through similar structures, and Clear Data's obfuscation was, by comparison, almost courteous. The core of it was this: Stratford Behavioral Insights was paying a company controlled by Diane Whitmore, a consulting LLC registered to Diane's home address in Fairfax County, approximately $4.200 per month in community liaison fees. In 18 months, this amounted to $75.600. For a woman who earned no disclosed salary from the HOA and lived in a home valued at $1.1 million with a $340,000 mortgage that she was somehow servicing on what publicly appeared to be investment income, this was a meaningful sum. Meanwhile, HOA fees in Riverside Oaks had increased 23% over 2 years, a fact Eleanor found in the annual reports. The rationale given: enhanced security infrastructure. She thought about the 33 cameras. She thought about Marcus sitting alone in Loretta's car. She thought about Priya crying after a 16-hour shift. She did not let herself get angry, because anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. But she allowed herself, briefly, to feel the cold clarity that had always guided her best work: this will end. She built a binder. Physical, not digital, because physical evidence has a presence that screens cannot replicate, and she had learned, in 21 years of briefings, that decision makers responded to weight. She printed everything. She organized it with the precision of someone who had once presented surveillance findings to a Senate subcommittee and had exactly 11 minutes to make her case. She documented Marcus's case. The extortion message, the metadata proving the camera it came from, the camera's location relative to his garage window, the signal log showing that footage had been uploaded to Clear Data's server 17 minutes after it was recorded. She documented Priya's case. The same chain of evidence, plus a legal analysis, which Eleanor had prepared herself because her second graduate degree was in cybersecurity law, of how the recording violated the Federal Wiretap Act, 18 U.S. C. Section 2511, which prohibits the intentional interception of wire, oral, or electronic communications. She found 4 additional residents who had received what they described as uncomfortable communications from the HOA regarding private matters that, as they now understood, could only have been known through camera footage. 2 agreed to provide written statements. 2 were afraid. Eleanor documented them all. She made 3 copies of the binder. 1 for Sandra. 1 for the Virginia Attorney General's office. 1 in the fireproof safe under her desk, which had a lock that most professional thieves would have needed 40 minutes and specialized tools to defeat. On a Sunday evening, 12 days after her call with Sandra, she sat in her kitchen and looked at the completed binder on her table. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, which she didn't particularly like, but which she drank in the evenings because her cardiologist had asked her to reduce caffeine and she was trying to be cooperative about it. She sat with the tea and the binder and the quiet. Then she opened her laptop and set a Honeypot. The Honeypot was a small wireless device that Eleanor had assembled from components ordered separately from 5 different vendors over the preceding 3 weeks. It was designed to look, to any scanning network, like an unsecured IoT camera of the type that Clear Data's collection system was calibrated to detect and sync with. She placed it, with Marcus's permission, on the exterior of his garage, angled to suggest it captured his driveway. It captured nothing. It was not a real camera. It was a signal emitter that, when Clear Data's system reached out to connect with it, would record the handshake protocol, the connecting server's authentication credentials, and the precise data request parameters. In other words, everything a federal prosecutor would need to demonstrate what Clear Data was actually collecting and how. She did not expect to wait long. She waited 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, at 3:17 a.m., the device registered a connection. Eleanor was asleep. She had set it to alert her phone. She woke, looked at the notification, pulled up the log on her tablet, and read the data while sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark. The connection request was automated, systematic, and completely unambiguous. Clear Data's collection system had attempted to pull video data from what it believed was a live residential camera, and in the process of attempting to authenticate, had handed Eleanor's device a complete record of its own architecture, server locations, data request protocols, the authentication keys it used to access its camera network, and a directory structure that made clear the data was being stored in categorized files organized by resident address and date. She read this twice. Then she called Sandra. "I have what you need," she said. "How complete?" "Complete enough to charge the system, not just the operator." A pause. "I'll get the paperwork moving." Meanwhile, Diane had not been idle. Diane had noticed the anomaly in her network. Eleanor's Honeypot, once it had been connected to, left a signature, and she had understood that something was wrong without knowing precisely what. She was not unintelligent, and her response to perceived threats followed a pattern Eleanor had seen many times in many different contexts: escalation masquerading as authority. The letter arrived on a Monday. It was from the same Richmond law firm, and it informed Eleanor that she was being assessed $850 in HOA fines for various violations including failure to obtain board approval for an auxiliary structure, Eleanor's garden shed, which had been there since 1987 and predated the CC&Rs by a decade, operating an unauthorized electronic device on community property, the Honeypot, which was not on community property, and conduct detrimental to the community under a catch-all provision in Section 18(4) of the CC&Rs that was written broadly enough to mean anything a motivated board president wanted it to mean. Eleanor read the letter twice, as she read everything twice. She noted that the letter had been sent by overnight mail, which suggested urgency. She noted that the unauthorized electronic device violation could only have been identified by someone monitoring her property with undisclosed surveillance equipment. She noted that by identifying the device in the violation letter, Diane had, in a single written document, confirmed awareness of the surveillance network, demonstrated its use for purposes unrelated to community security, and provided Eleanor with a documented admission that would have been very useful in a court proceeding. She photographed the letter. She added it to the binder. Then she wrote a response. The response was 4 pages. It was not angry. It was methodical. It cited Virginia Code 55. 1-1820 regarding residents' rights to inspect association records. It cited the Americans with Disabilities Act in connection with Priya's case, because Diane's attempt to weaponize a medical professional's moment of emotional distress had ADA implications Eleanor had been meaning to include. It cited the Federal Wiretap Act. It cited the FTC Act regarding deceptive data collection practices. It cited a 2019 Fourth Circuit decision regarding privacy expectations in residential settings. The last paragraph read, "Please be advised that this response is being forwarded simultaneously to the Virginia Attorney General's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cyber Division, and the Federal Trade Commission. I am available to discuss the above matters at a time and location of your legal counsel's choosing." She sent it by certified mail. She also, and this was deliberate, slid a copy under Roger Hallstrom's door. Roger Hallstrom called her at 9 p.m. that same evening. He was a 67-year-old retired contractor who had joined the HOA board 5 years ago because he liked the idea of keeping the common areas well maintained and had not fully understood, at the time, the nature of the person he was agreeing to serve alongside. He had since understood it very thoroughly and had been unable to figure out how to extricate himself without consequences. "I need to know how much trouble I'm in," he said, without preamble. "That depends on how much you knew and when you knew it," Eleanor said, with equal directness. There was a long pause. "I didn't know about the cameras," he said. "I mean, I knew there were security cameras. I approved the original 8. The rest of them," he stopped. "She said they were part of a grant. A community safety grant from the county. I didn't ask questions I should have asked." "The maintenance contracts," Eleanor said. "Who approved those?" "I did. But I didn't know what they were for." She presented them as IT infrastructure. "When did you find out what was actually happening?" Another pause, and she could tell from the quality of his silence that this was the question he'd been dreading. "About 4 months ago," he said quietly. "I saw an invoice. Stratford Behavioral Insights. I looked it up. I didn't say anything." He stopped again. "I have a granddaughter," he said, as if this were an explanation, or perhaps an apology. "Roger," Eleanor said, "I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you'd rather know where you stand. You have a problem. Passive participation in an illegal scheme creates liability even without active intent. But cooperation significantly changes the picture." "What kind of cooperation?" "Written statement. Specific dates, specific documents you saw, specific representations Diane made to you regarding the camera network and the service contracts. She'll know it was me." "She already knows something is wrong," Eleanor said. "The question isn't whether she knows. The question is whether you're standing on the right side when everything resolves." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay. How do I do this?" "Come to my house tomorrow morning. Bring whatever documents you can access from your own records, anything with your name on it. I'll walk you through it." After she hung up, she updated her notes. She had, now, 2 extortion victims, 4 corroborating witnesses, Roger's anticipated statement, the architecture map, the corporate structure analysis, the Honeypot data, and Diane's accidental written confirmation of surveillance. She had documentation of $75,600 in payments to Diane's company. She had 18 months of upload logs. She was ready. She called Sandra and told her so. "Thursday morning," Sandra said. 7 a.m. We'll need you there for technical guidance." "I'll be there," Eleanor said. There were things that happened before Thursday that Eleanor would remember afterward. She would remember Priya coming over on a Wednesday evening and sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor walked her through what was going to happen, step by step, in the plain and measured language she'd used for years in rooms full of people who needed clarity more than comfort. Priya was frightened, and she said so, and Eleanor respected her enough not to pretend that fear was unreasonable. "The video of you," Eleanor said, "is evidence of the crime, not evidence against you. The moment this goes federal, it becomes an exhibit demonstrating what was done to you." Priya sat with that. "I've been feeling like I did something wrong," she said. "Like maybe I should have been less emotional after a 16-hour shift. Like maybe I gave them ammunition." "You cried in your car," Eleanor said. "After 16 hours of caring for sick children. There is no version of that story in which you did something wrong." Priya looked at her hands. "She chose you," Eleanor continued, "because she thought you couldn't fight back. She does that with everyone she targets, the single mothers. The people grieving. The people who look like they're alone." She paused. "She was wrong about all of you. But she was most wrong about you," Because you came and knocked on my door. Priya looked up. Why'd you let me in? She asked. You didn't know me. Eleanor considered this genuinely. Because I recognized the look, she said. I've seen it in people who've been told that the system doesn't work for them and then discovered it might, after all. It's a particular kind of hope that people are embarrassed to show. She picked up her tea. I wasn't going to turn that away. She would also remember the conversation with Marcus on the evening before Thursday, sitting on his front steps in the dark while the neighborhood went about its end-of-day rhythms around them. You never told me what you used to do, he said. No, Eleanor agreed. Federal, I'm guessing. Something classified. Something like that. He was quiet for a moment. When I was on the force, he said, you develop a sense for people pretty fast. Whether they're carrying something. Whether they're more than what they appear. He looked over at her. I had you pegged from about the second week. Didn't know the specifics, but I knew you weren't just watering tomatoes. Eleanor smiled. And you didn't ask. Figured you'd tell me if I needed to know. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. With the thing about Loretta's car. You just lost your wife, Eleanor said. And you were alone, and someone had used it against you. People don't fight back when they're in that place. They survive. She looked at the street. You came around eventually. That's enough. Thursday arrived the way significant days often do, looking exactly like every other day until it didn't. Eleanor was on her porch at 5:47, watering her tomatoes. At 6:55 a.m., 3 vehicles, 2 black SUVs and a white sedan with federal plates, turned onto Magnolia Crest Drive without haste or drama and parked precisely where they were supposed to park. Sandra Cole got out of the lead SUV wearing a dark blazer and the particular expression of someone who had been awake since 4 o'clock and had drunk exactly enough coffee to function without appearing to need it. She had 4 agents with her. 2 were technical specialists. They reviewed the execution plan at Eleanor's kitchen table for 11 minutes. Eleanor answered 3 technical questions. Then Sandra's team separated into 2 groups, one for the HOA administrative office at the community center, one for the address on record for Diane Whitmore. Eleanor stayed on her street. She was, technically, there to be available if the technical team had questions about the network architecture. In practice, she stood on the sidewalk in front of Marcus's house with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and watched the morning happen. At 7:23 a.m., the white Escalade was still in Diane's driveway when the second group of agents arrived. Eleanor couldn't see the front door from where she stood, but she could hear, in the particular way that sound carries on quiet residential streets in the early morning, the moment Diane opened the door and the moment that followed. Marcus came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. At 9:11 a.m., the Escalade moved. It went slowly down the street, driven by an agent, with Diane Whitmore in the back seat, and as it passed the point where Eleanor and Marcus were standing, Eleanor did not look away and Diane did not look away, and they held each other's gaze through the window for the 3 seconds it took the vehicle to pass. Diane's face was a controlled expression that was trying very hard to be imperious and was not quite managing it. Eleanor's face was the same face she used for everything, attentive, even, giving nothing away for free. She nodded once. The Escalade continued to the end of the street and turned. That's that, Marcus said. Not quite, Eleanor said. But mostly. The community meeting was not officially called. Nobody sent notices. Word simply moved through Riverside Oaks the way it always does in close communities, at mailboxes, over back fences, through text message chains, and by 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, the community center was full. Eleanor estimated 200 residents, which was more than had attended any HOA meeting in the association's history. Nobody was running the meeting. This, Eleanor thought, was appropriate. Marcus stood up first, because someone needed to, and because he had spent 30 years on a police force and knew how to hold a room without performing for it. He told them what had happened, plainly and without embellishment: the surveillance cameras, the data collection, the extortion, the federal investigation. He did not protect Diane's reputation, but he also did not perform outrage. He was factual. He was steady. He sounded like someone who had seen enough actual harm in his life to know that manufactured drama served nothing. Priya spoke after him. This was braver than anything else that happened that evening, Eleanor thought, because Priya had to stand up in front of 200 people who were her neighbors and tell them that she had been targeted and threatened and had almost been silenced. She did it anyway, in the composed and honest voice of someone who had decided that shame belonged to the person who had done this, not to her. Roger Hallstrom spoke briefly. He apologized. He did not make excuses. Eleanor thought this was the right choice and was privately glad he'd made it. At some point, someone said, "Where's Dr. Vance?" And Eleanor raised her hand from the back of the room, and there was a response, a kind of exhale of recognition from the crowd, that she found more affecting than she'd expected. She did not speak at length. She explained the technical elements in accessible terms, because she thought people deserved to understand what had been done to them and how, not just that it had happened. She answered questions for 20 minutes. She was careful, throughout, to make clear that the ongoing federal investigation was in Sandra's hands, not hers, and that residents who had concerns about specific incidents should contact the FBI field office directly. Toward the end of the evening, a woman Eleanor didn't know well, she lived on the other side of the development, Elm Court, raised her hand and asked, "Did you know this was going to happen when you moved here? Were you sent here?" "No," Eleanor said. "I came here for the same reason most people come to a place like this. I wanted to be somewhere quiet." A small pause. "I found it wasn't." The legal resolution took 6 months, as these things do. Diane Whitmore was charged with 14 counts, including violations of the Federal Wiretap Act, wire fraud, extortion, and unlawful interception of electronic communications. Clear Data Residential Analytics and its parent company Stratford Behavioral Insights were the subjects of coordinated FTC and DOJ actions alleging unfair and deceptive data collection practices affecting 340 households over an 18-month period. The FTC action also named the data brokers downstream who had purchased the information. The HOA's financial records, reviewed by a court-appointed auditor, revealed that HOA fees had been inflated to pay for the surveillance infrastructure at a total cost to residents of approximately $280,000, none of which had been disclosed or voted on. Roger Hallstrom was not charged, in recognition of his cooperation. He resigned from the board. A court-appointed receiver administered the HOA for 4 months while new elections were organized. Priya was elected board president with 91% of votes cast. Marcus Webb declined to run but accepted an appointed role on the new Safety Committee, which had a mandate to establish surveillance policies with explicit resident consent requirements. The civil settlement against Diane Whitmore and the associated entities resulted in $1.4 million in damages distributed to affected residents. Eleanor received a portion proportional to what she'd been charged in fraudulent fees. She set it aside. The white Escalade with the Oaks 1 plate sat in the driveway of Diane's house for several weeks after Diane was remanded pending trial, until the house was placed under receivership and the contents were sold. Eleanor noticed, walking past one morning, that someone had put a sticky note on the Escalade's windshield. She couldn't read it from the street. She didn't try. On a Friday afternoon in late October, Priya came to Eleanor's house with a bottle of wine and the news that the board had voted unanimously to remove all 33 undisclosed cameras from the Riverside Oaks network, to implement a resident privacy policy, and to post the complete financial records of the association on the community website on a quarterly basis. They sat on the porch, because the October light was doing what it does in Virginia in the fall, going gold and slant across the neighborhood, and it was too good to waste indoors. "I want to ask you something," Priya said, "and I hope it's not rude." "Ask," Eleanor said. "You could have done this differently. You had, I don't know what you had access to, technically. But you obviously could have just handed all of this to the FBI on day one. Why did you take 12 days to build the case yourself first?" Eleanor turned her wine glass in her hands. "2 reasons," she said. "First, a case built by a private citizen with documented, lawful methodology is harder to challenge than one built purely by federal action. It has a different chain of custody. It demonstrates that the evidence exists independently of government interest." Priya nodded. "And the second reason?" Eleanor looked out at the street. A family was walking past, the Nguyens from Birchwood Place, who had 2 small children who always walked very seriously, as if each step required consideration. "The second reason," Eleanor said, "is that I wanted the people this had been done to, you, Marcus, the others, to understand what had happened to them. Not as victims of a crime they'd been told about after the fact, but as people who had been part of solving it." She paused. "There's a difference between being rescued and being part of the rescue." Priya was quiet for a moment. "They chose us because they thought we were powerless," she said. "Yes. They look for people they think can't fight back. Single women. People who are grieving. People who've already lost fights with systems before." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And they're usually right, because the systems they exploit, HOA regulations, corporate legal structures, surveillance infrastructure, are deliberately opaque. Most people don't know their rights, don't have access to legal help, and don't have the bandwidth to fight a sustained campaign while also working and raising children and getting through their days. She set her glass down. Which means, she continued, that the most dangerous thing to that kind of operation is not a regulator or a federal agent, though those matter. It's someone in the community who knows what they're looking at. Because regulators come and go. Cases open and close. But a community that understands what was done to it, and why, and how, that community is genuinely harder to exploit again. Priya was quiet for a moment. Is that why you're staying? Eleanor looked at the hydrangeas along the left fence, which had done exactly as they pleased again this year. I'm staying because I like my garden, she said. And because I have nowhere better to be. A pause. But yes. Also because of that. That winter, Eleanor used a portion of her civil settlement to establish what she called, in its founding charter, the Riverside Oaks Resident Resource Cooperative. It was a modest thing, a small fund that paid for an hour of pro bono legal consultation for any resident who believed their rights under the CC&Rs or Virginia housing law had been violated, plus a monthly information session at the library where Eleanor, or occasionally a guest from the legal aid clinic in Maplewood, explained what HOA residents' rights actually were in plain language. She did not call these sessions empowerment workshops. She called them reading the fine print, which was accurate. The sessions were not particularly dramatic. People asked questions about mailbox regulations and fence height disputes and what constituted a valid violation notice. Eleanor answered them as she answered everything, directly, without condescension, with the full weight of her expertise applied to whatever the person in front of her needed to know. She did not do this because she had become an activist. She was not, by temperament, an activist. She did it because she had spent 2 decades working inside systems and had learned, slowly and not always comfortably, that systems do not improve by themselves. They improve when enough people understand them well enough to hold them to account. This was what she had done in her career, at a national scale, in ways she could never fully describe to anyone outside the classified world. She could do a version of it here, in a neighborhood in Maplewood County, at a library table with a coffee urn and a handout she'd formatted herself. It was, she thought, not a bad use of a Friday evening. The rosemary bush was still there. Eleanor had never removed it. During the HOA's administrative receivership period, someone had gone through the pending violation list and quietly closed 340 open citations that the court-appointed receiver determined had been assessed without proper procedural basis, which was most of them. Eleanor's rosemary citation had been among the first 10. She had made a note of that and then forgotten it, because there were more important things to track, and the rosemary had never needed the paperwork to justify its existence. By the following spring, it had grown another 8 inches. It had also seeded into the adjacent bed, producing 3 small volunteer plants that Eleanor decided to leave where they were, because they were thriving without her intervention, which seemed like a good sign. She was watering them on a Tuesday morning, 5:47, because the ritual never changed, when Marcus came around the corner with 2 cups of coffee from the good place on Route 9. He had started doing this on irregular Tuesday mornings, which had become a kind of standing arrangement that neither of them had formally proposed. He handed her a cup and looked at the volunteer rosemary. "That stuff's spreading," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "You going to do anything about it?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "I think I'm going to let it go where it wants." Marcus nodded as if this settled something, and they stood there in the morning light for a while, drinking their coffee, not saying anything in particular, while the neighborhood came awake around them in the slow and ordinary way that good neighborhoods do. Garbage trucks at one end, a school bus at the other, a dog barking twice at something in the hedges and then stopping, satisfied. Eleanor watched it all with the quiet attention she gave everything. She was, she thought, not unhappy here. She had not expected to be. Years later, 2, or perhaps 3, she did not mark them carefully, a young woman appeared at one of her Friday library sessions. She was 28, perhaps 30, and she sat in the back row and did not ask any questions during the main session, but waited until everyone else had gone and then approached the table where Eleanor was packing up the handouts. She had moved to Riverside Oaks 6 months ago, she said. She was a software engineer. She had received 3 HOA violation notices in those 6 months for things she was fairly certain were not actual violations, and she had the distinct impression that she was being targeted specifically. She hesitated, and then said it plainly, because she was a black woman in a neighborhood that had not previously had many black residents, and because whoever was sending these notices had decided, correctly or otherwise, that she would be easier to wear down than to reason with. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Show me the notices," she said. The young woman, her name was Camille, pulled out her phone. Eleanor looked at each notice carefully. They were formally worded, superficially plausible, and, on examination, entirely without basis in the current CC&Rs as revised by the board following the federal settlement, which included explicit non-discrimination provisions that Eleanor had, at Priya's request, helped draft. 2 of these reference sections of the CC&Rs that no longer exist, Eleanor said. This one, she pointed to the third, references a section that does exist but doesn't say what they're claiming it says. Camille looked at her. So what do I do? Eleanor handed her a copy of the handout, which was titled, in 11-point Arial, Your Rights as a Homeowner in a Virginia HOA, a plain language summary. You respond in writing, she said. Certified mail. You cite the specific provision they've referenced, note that it does not support the claimed violation, and inform them that you consider the notice without legal basis. You request the original documentation supporting the violation within 10 days, as provided under Virginia Code 55. 1-1820. You keep copies of everything. Camille looked at the handout. That's it? That's the first step, Eleanor said. Most of the time, that's sufficient. Whoever is sending these is counting on you not knowing the code section exists. She paused. If they persist, come back. We'll go to the next step. Camille folded the handout carefully. She looked up. How do you know all of this? She asked. Eleanor picked up her bag. Through the library window, the parking lot lights were coming on in the early dark, and the street beyond was doing what streets do in the evening, filling with the motion of people heading somewhere, going home, going to dinner, going about the ordinary business of their lives. Because someone needed to, she said simply. And I happened to be here. She held the door, and they walked out together into the cool fall air, and Eleanor pointed Camille toward the community resource binder at the front desk, the one with the updated CC&Rs and the contact sheet for the legal aid clinic, and showed her where to find what she needed. Behind them, the library settled into its evening quiet. On Magnolia Crest Drive, the rosemary grew.